Hello everyone, I'm going to read excerpts from Chapter 4 of The 4 Signs of a Dynamic Catholic, and it's about the third sign, generosity. The happiest people I know. The happiest people I know are also the most generous people I know. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. The world proposes selfishness as the path to happiness. God proposes generosity as the path to happiness. I know many selfish people, but I don't know any who have a deep and lasting happiness. Selfish people always seem restless and discontented. The happiness we experience through selfishness is fleeting because it is dependent on external circumstances. But I also know some very generous people, and their happiness is not dependent on things going their way or in getting what they want. Their happiness is rooted in the life of God. This joy springs up from something that is taking place within them. We are all invited to that life and that happiness, and generosity is the path that leads there. Sometimes I wonder, what is God really like? We spend a lot of time talking about God and church, religion and spirituality, but sometimes all this talk can get in the way of us really thinking about God. Have you ever wondered what God is really like? How would you describe it? Finish this sentence. God is love is how John's gospel finishes this sentence. John 4:8. What words would you use to describe God? One word I would use is generous. In everything we attribute to God, I see immense acts of generosity. Creation is generous. Free will is generous. Life is generous. Love is generous. The generosity of God is awesome. We find this divine generosity displayed in incredible ways by Jesus. I love to read the Gospels. I read them over and over again and always seem to catch new glimpses into the life and teachings of Jesus. The Gospels are always fresh. It's not that they change, but I change. The circumstances of my life change. The questions I'm grappling with change, and so the Gospels seem new. Or perhaps it's because I wasn't open to a certain truth the last time I read a particular passage. But God has brought me to a new place, liberated me from a bias or blind spot, so now I'm open to a truth that was always there. As I've been preparing to write this book, I have pondered the theme of generosity in the Gospels. It turns out it's a significant theme. All the great figures that emerge in the Gospels are generous. Sure, you have the widow's mite, an obvious act of generosity, but in every great gospel figure, you find generosity. Mary's response to God when the angel appeared to her was an incredible act of faith, surrender, and generosity. The Magi, traveling from afar with gifts for the infant Jesus, were generous. The centurion, begging Jesus to cure his servant, was generous. The first 12 leaving everything to follow Jesus was incredibly generous. And then there is Jesus himself. His first miracle in Cana was not a miracle of need. It was a miracle of abundance and generosity. Throughout his life, he served people by teaching them, feeding them, healing them, providing spiritual leadership, and comforting them. Finally, in his suffering and death on the cross, he laid down his life for us in the ultimate act of generosity. The Gospels are a story about the triumph of generosity. Generosity is at the heart of the Christian life, just as it is at the heart of the gospel. For it is often through our generosity that we're able to bring the love of God to life for others in very real and tangible ways. God is by his very nature generous. God wants to convince us of his generosity, and in turn, wants us to live generous lives. Generosity begins with gratitude. Are we grateful for all the blessings that God has poured upon us? In the interviews conducted with dynamic Catholics, it became obvious that highly engaged Catholics live in a state of gratitude. They have an overwhelming sense that their lives have been blessed. When I asked them to talk about the blessings that inspired this gratitude, they did not speak about extraordinary things. In fact, I heard nothing in those interviews that suggested that these people were any more blessed than others. But they recognized their blessings. They took time to regularly identify the people, opportunities, and possessions that brought them gratitude. It was a humbling experience for me. I realized that I have so much to be grateful for, but I often take those blessings for granted or simply fail to reflect upon them. We are at our best when we are grateful. In Chapter 1, we spoke about spiritual health. One of the leading indicators of my own spiritual health is whether or not I am in a place of gratitude. I have observed this time and time again. When I get in a bad mood or become overwhelmed by a situation, I've usually lost the perspective of gratitude. Next time you're in a bad mood, ask yourself if you're grateful. It's impossible to be grateful and be in a bad mood. It's when we step away from gratitude that we become irritable, restless, and discontented. The world draws us into a conversation about all that we don't have, but God invites us into a conversation about all that we do have. Which of those conversations is bouncing around your head today? Stewardship and providence. When we speak about generosity at church, we usually do so in the context of stewardship, and we talk about 3 categories: time, talent, and treasure. As Christians, we are taught that our time, talent, and treasure are all on loan to us from God, and that one day we'll have to give an account for the way we manage them. The world says to do whatever you want with your time and talent, and as for your treasure, it's your stuff. You earned it, it belongs to you. What does God have to do with it? As for other people, let them take care of themselves. When we forget the true source of things, disorder begins to reign in our lives. God wants to lead us out of the chaos of this world and into His divine order. Are you a good steward of what God entrusted to you? Think about it for a moment. I know I've raised many questions in this book, but slow down, pause, and reflect upon this for a minute or two. If you consider the past 24 hours, were you a good steward of this time? How much time did you waste? How much time did you spend that didn't help you become a better version of yourself? Did you take time to pray? Did you give prayer your best time when you had the energy to focus, or your worst time when you were exhausted from another busy day? It's humbling to think about these questions, but unless we take the time to reflect on how purposefully we are approaching our role as stewards, we cannot grow in this area. Now think about your talents. Are you a good steward of the talents God has entrusted to you? Are you using them to create the most good for the most people? Are you neglecting a talent God has given you? Are you a good steward of the treasure God has entrusted to you? Are you grateful for the money and possessions that flow through your life? Are you generous with the things you have? Do you make them available to others to enjoy, or do you guard them jealously? Are you generous with the money you have at your disposal? Stewardship is one of the largest responsibilities God places on our shoulders. It is impossible to live up to this responsibility unless we approach it with great intentionality. The world places many obstacles in our way as we quest to be good and faithful stewards of all God has entrusted to us. Providence and social justice are also at the core of the stewardship discussion. The central question in any discussion about divine providence is, do you trust that God will provide for you? Intellectually and theologically, it's easy to say yes, but practically, we prefer not to have to rely on God. We prefer to take things into our own hands, and that is the line that we cross to join the world's perspective of self-determinism. Part of the reason is trust, but the other part is greed. God's promise is that He'll provide for our needs, not that He'll provide for our greed. This is where our world collides with our neighbors. When we place our wants before our neighbors' needs, we abandon our posts as stewards. There's plenty of food in the world to feed everyone, and yet more than 2 billion men, women, and children are hungry right now. And it's not just in foreign lands that people are hungry. More than 20% of children in the United States live in poverty. Mother Teresa was more in touch with human need than most. It was out of her vast experience with suffering of so many that she counseled us. Live simply so that others may simply live. It's sobering to think that if we were willing to go without some of the things that complicate our lives, or so many of the things that we don't really need, we would be able to save lives. Once again, the gospel challenges us not theoretically, but in real and practical ways. I discovered this quote from Fulton Sheen. Never measure your generosity by what you give, but rather by what you have left. Generosity and justice go hand in hand. If we take seriously our role as stewards of all God has entrusted to us, we will grow with every passing year to become more generous. If we are truly generous, then social justice will become an integral part of who we are. When the gospel is fully alive within us, there's no need to speak of such social justice as something separate or to think of it as another topic, for it is integral to the authentic Christian life. Once we immerse ourselves in the gospel, we realize that there is a level of generosity that goes beyond simply giving money and things to the poor. It is a generosity that challenges us to change the conditions that make them poor. The needs of others are always an invitation from God for us to live generously. Every day, many prayers go unanswered, and it seems to me that this is not because God did not want those prayers answered, but because He sent us to answer those prayers, and we didn't heed the call. The scope of our generosity. As I examined the lives and habits of dynamic Catholics, I discovered immense generosity. What really captured my attention was the variety of ways their generosity manifested itself in daily life. Generosity is a trademark of dynamic Catholics. Their generosity in the traditional ways was to be expected. They're generous with their time, talent, with their money and possessions, but their generosity goes way beyond those commonly defined areas. It was the scope of their generosity that was particularly inspiring to me. What I discovered was not just a spirit of generosity, but a spirituality of generosity that reached deep into every corner of their lives. Being generous is not just something they do, it's part of who they are. Generosity is central to their value system, and they often think in terms of how they can do the most with what they have at their disposal. The 7% are generous lovers, parents, and grandparents. Their neighbors and colleagues at work often acknowledge them among the most generous people they know. They are generous with their praise and their appreciation. They are especially generous in their encouragement. They are constantly encouraging people all around them. The scope of their generosity reaches into every aspect of life. Most of us are passively generous to an extent. Dynamic Catholics are proactively generous. They don't wait to be asked. They are looking for opportunities to be generous. This all-around generosity makes them much loved by people who are close to them, as well as by people who know them just a little. It also makes them a beacon of God's love in their community. Ask them what source of this great generosity is, and they almost always cite how blessed they consider themselves to be, and how they themselves have been the recipients of incredible generosity throughout the course of their lives. They are strikingly grateful, and it became apparent just by talking to them that their gratitude and generosity are inseparably linked. How generous are you? Most people think of themselves as generous. But if you get any group of people together and ask them for their time, talent, or treasure, some will be far more generous than others. The temptation is to say that those who give more money have more money, or those who volunteer more time have more time. But this isn't true. Very often, the busiest people are most generous with volunteering. When I met with volunteers and learn about their lives, I think to myself, how on earth did you find the time to put together such a great event? The answer is they didn't find time. They made time. Similarly, there are numerous studies that show that people with relatively modest incomes and virtually no wealth are often more generous than those who have much more. They make giving a priority. We are all called to live generous lives, and to grow in the area of generosity is one of the surest ways to grow spiritually. But in order to grow our generosity, we first need to get a sense of where we are today. How generous are you? Give yourself a generosity score between 1 and 10, with 1 being the meanest, dingiest person you can think of. Think Scrooge from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And 10 being the most generous person you've ever known. Circle your score between 1 and 10. Now, let's break down into 3 areas of stewardship that we generally talk about at church: time, talent, and treasure. How generous are you with your